This is the Jay Severin Show.
I would argue with you that this is one of the most significant historical moments, and rather a dark one as it looks at the outset, for which we are gathered. And in this maelstrom, there are really only two principles. Though we are part of this story, we have standing as citizens of the United States of America. There are two principles. One is the President of the United States, from whom we've heard quite enough, thank you. The other, and arguably more important principle in this, is the President of the National Rifle Association. David Keene is known to me, owing to my former life, my career in political consulting, during his chairmanship of the seminal American Conservative Union. David Keene is one of the single most prominent and influential thinkers, strategists, spokesmen for causes conservative of his generation. I can think of virtually no significant conservative movement in my lifetime in which David Keene has not played a principal role. As such, we are in his debt. And now here, yet again, at the eye of the storm, in the center of the fight, our fight, is David Keene. David, welcome, a grateful welcome to the Blaze Network.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I guess I'll have to pay you for that introduction later.
Thanks so much for taking time. I know it's a slow day for you, so I'm glad you could. I'm glad we could help fill up some of the empty time, David.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I've been running
just
around
for the
a little
record,
bit, but you know it's necessary because this really is, in terms of the Second Amendment, this is it. This is
yes.
the battle that we've been concerned about. It's the war that we knew was coming, and it's the war we warned people about as we approached this last fall's election, because we've got ourselves a president who has been an enemy of the Second Amendment since before, I used to say since before he thought about running for office, but that's probably something I can't prove. It certainly has been a goal of his since he got into public life and before he ran for office. He's been an anti-Second Amendment activist as a private citizen, as a state legislator, as a United States senator, and then tried to cloak it all during his campaigns because he was afraid of the backlash from those who are strong Second Amendment supporters. But now that he's reelected, and now that he doesn't have to face the voters again, he's indicated a willingness to do what he's always wanted to do, which is to gut the Second Amendment.
David, do you have any doubt that President Obama's and his political base goal is to, at the least, severely diminish and more likely effectively abolish Second Amendment rights?
I don't think there's any question about that. You know, in the past, he has said, both publicly and privately, that he doesn't believe any American has a right as a private citizen to own any kind of a firearm. He's voted for, at lower levels, legislation that would have abolished anything except a single-fire shotgun and rifle. He said that handguns should not be manufactured, sold, traded, or owned or possessed in the United States. This is not a fellow who's interested in nipping at the fringes of the Second Amendment. This is a fellow who, if he has his druthers, will drive a stake right into the heart of the right to private ownership of firearms in this country and to the Second Amendment of our Constitution.
As president of the NRA, in your opinion, is this president honoring his oath to protect, preserve, and defend the Constitution?
No, he's not, because he claims, as you saw yesterday, that he believes in the Second Amendment. He said that during the campaign. That's bunkum. The fact of the matter is that he's never believed in the Second Amendment as it's been interpreted or as it was written. And if his oath requires him to defend the Constitution as it exists rather than as he might wish it had been written, then he's violating it.
A number of congressmen, a growing number as well you know, have talked about the introduction of articles of impeachment on the basis of the issuance of these extra-constitutional, I would say anti-constitutional, executive orders. What's your opinion in that matter?
Well, I don't know that they're going to have to go that far, but let's look at this president and what he's done. And my major concern these days, of course, is the Second Amendment and the right of American citizens to own firearms for sporting purposes and defend themselves and the like. But this is a guy who earlier said he sometimes wishes he could rule this country the way they rule China without having to worry about a legislative branch.
Right.
And I think he believes that. He has tried
That pesky legislative branch.
Pardon me?
That pesky legislative branch.
That's right. Those representatives of the people. They are just an encumbrance on his ability to rule, and he has tried and announced from time to time that he will go around the Congress whenever he can. That's what he's trying to do here. And I think that he's going to run into a real roadblock, not just from Second Amendment supporters, not just from gun owners, but if you're a member of Congress from either party, you have your own constitutional obligation to be jealous of the prerogatives of the branch in which you serve. That's what the Constitution was designed to create, a tension between the executive and the legislative that would keep the government under control. And this is a president who is trying to build the imperial presidency that liberals have always claimed Republicans and conservatives would like to build. He's doing it. He's going around the Congress. But as you look at the executive orders and things that he's issuing, it's one thing to issue an order. It's another thing to get the money to implement the order. Mm-hmm. And most of these things can be forced back into Congress. Appropriations riders can be put on bills saying no funds will be expended for this purpose. And he is going to go into Congress and have to face some votes. I think part of what he was trying to do with the executive orders is get members of his own party off the hook, because if they have to vote on many of these things and compile a record of anti-Second Amendment votes, that's going to make a huge difference in the next election. Remember what happened in 1994, in large measure because of the high-handedness of the Clinton administration in imposing anti-gun legislation.
And as well David Keene, a number of prominent Democrats have already defected very noisily and very publicly from President Obama on this, and I haven't yet looked at the template of whether those are the ones up in the next election, but I'll bet there's a pretty close relationship.
Well, a number of them are, because they've got constituents who feel very differently than the president. But some of them, the newly elected senator from North Dakota. North Dakota,
yes, yep.
Who's just here, doesn't have to face re-election, and immediately said this stuff was extreme. She and her constituents weren't for it. These Democrats, and remember, if you think about the NRA and you think about the Second Amendment, not everybody who believes in the Second Amendment is a conservative like me or a Republican. Our membership is probably 30% Democratic and Independent. We've got labor union members, and until the culture wars of the late 60s broke out and gun rights became an ideological issue, there was no real disagreement. Everybody thought the founders knew how to write a legible sentence. They thought that the Second Amendment meant what the founders said it meant, and there was bipartisan support for the shooting sports and for the right to keep and bear arms. That changed in the late 60s with the passage of the Gun Control Act of 68 and has been ongoing since then. But a lot of our members are still Democrats. And there are a lot of Democrats out there who I may disagree with on other things, but given their druthers would support the Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms. They are the president's first target because they are the ones most susceptible to pressure from the White House. And this freshman senator is already back home facing a barrage of attack ads from the left for her refusal to get into lockstep with the president.
If it's possible, David, to prioritize, which are the most odious of Obama's extra constitutional executive orders pertaining to the Second Amendment, or is it just the whole?
Well, it's all of it, but when you look at prioritizing it, it seems to me that the one thing that we and most supporters of the Second Amendment have always opposed is the establishment of any kind of national gun registry. Because if the government knows who owns what and where it is, then you've got the stage set for confiscation. Now, people say we're paranoid, but within the last 2 weeks, Dianne Feinstein in California and Andrew Cuomo in New York have both suggested that once they get registration, they can have what we call forced buybacks, where they say, you own that gun, you're going to sell it to the government. That's confiscation, and that's the ultimate fear that people ought to have. And if you read through the statement, he keeps talking about collecting data on firearms owners, and that's what we're most opposed to. You go beyond that, and you get to the question of the assault weapons ban and all of those things. Once you accept the idea that guns, firearms, inanimate objects are responsible for crimes, for killings, rather than the people who misuse them, then you're on a slippery slope. And if you listen to the president, did he talk about criminals? He talked about gun violence, as if in Chicago, guns on their own kill people. That's not the way it works. And I think that this whole thing as a package, when you look at it, is I said yesterday that it looked to me like somebody went back into the storeroom and pulled every left-wing dreamer's gun proposal off the shelf, threw them all into the vice president's office, and came up with this list, because there's nothing new on it. It's all,
and it's true.
It's all sort of regurgitated proposals from the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and what they're doing is using a tragedy to try and get the ideological attack that they've always wanted to mount on the Second Amendment going.
It's true, is it not, that taken even as a whole, as many have exposed already, not one of the 23, nor any of the attendant proclamations, not one of these would have changed the tragedy in Connecticut by a molecule, nor is there a rationale to suggest that any of them would change future events.
Well, that's our problem. This whole effort, which they say is designed to make our children safer, is in fact an effort designed to use our children to pursue an ideological agenda. If you look at what's happened, there are things that can in fact be done to lessen the chances of this. The real problem is that beginning in the late 50s, we destroyed in this country our mental health care system. Every one of these shooters is somebody who is severely mentally ill, and yet everybody's passed him up. You know, the Aurora shooter, the only person, and a lot of people saw the signs, but the only person who acted on it was a gun dealer. He went in to try and buy a gun, and the gun dealer looked at him and said, "This guy's nuts. I'm not selling him a firearm," you know. But the authorities didn't do anything. I use the example of, here's the kind of thing that results in what happened there. A couple of weeks ago, as you may have seen the story, a woman in New York pushed somebody under a subway train.
Yes.
That woman had been diagnosed as potentially violently schizophrenic. She refused to take her medications. Her mother had called the police 5 times after she'd virtually destroyed their home and threatened to kill the family. She'd been arrested 14 times by the police. She'd assaulted a police officer. Nobody did anything about it, and as a result, she killed somebody. Now, if her brain hadn't blown at that moment, she might have gotten her hands on a gun and killed more people. Yeah. She might have gotten her hands on explosives. There are people like that out there, and some of them end up at Sandy Hook, and some of them end up in theaters at Aurora. Yeah. And we need to learn how to deal with that problem, not with whatever weapon it is
David,
they get.
Forgive me for cutting in, because there's one question I did want to get in.
Sure.
We're short on time. This audience would love, Coast to Coast would love, I know, to hear your reaction to CBS's Bob Schieffer making an equivalence between fighting the NRA to fighting Nazis.
Well, you know, he's participating in the effort that the president's leading. Listen to that. This is typical Barack Obama, the statement yesterday. One, he sets himself up as the only reasonable man on earth. And his solutions to whatever problem he perceives are the common sense solutions. And then he says that everybody would go along with that, but for some evil force. The evil force in this instance is the National Rifle Association. So it's no accident that we're demonized. It's no accident as a result of all of this that, for example, you can go on the internet and find a game called
The Jay Severin Show on the Blaze Radio Network. Mercury.